Okay, the YouTube is up, and all right, we are almost live. All right, we're live.
All right, Jainism, everyone. My name is Sapna Jain. Welcome to our webinar on Jainism and law, politics, and government. This is the third webinar in our career series. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments and we will try to answer as many as we can. We have a few people who aren't able to join us tonight who are supposed to be on the panel. And if you had questions specifically for them, you can send those to education@yga.org and we will try to get those answers to you. Again, so starting off, my name is Sapna. I'm your moderator for today. I am an attorney and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And I do labor and employment work, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But can each of the panelists go around and tell us their name, their profession, and sort of what made them why did you guys decide to choose this career path? And you can sort of add things that you want to that. Gerard, we'll start with you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sapna and Parsha and YJ. It's delightful to be with everybody. I've been part of YJ for many, many years back when I had hair, so it's delightful to join you all again. So this is great. I am a federal lobbyist and a state lobbyist and a lawyer. I work for a group called AHOA. It's the Asian American Hotel Owners Association. It's based in Atlanta, but we have an office in Washington, D.C. Previously, I've worked as a campaign manager for the Wisconsin Attorney General at the Republican National Committee, as well as on Capitol Hill, among other political and legal jobs. And I found this path. Jainism definitely had an impact on the way I came about this career. Jainism has always been a logical religion. It's something that prides itself, ironically, in logic, and so that always appealed to me, and sort of finding the career path in law. But for me, I went down the political side as well for influencing my decision to find a political party in the Republican Party. Individual responsibility has always been a tenet of Jainism. Being pro-life, things along those lines, really influenced my decision to go into politics, and in particular become a Republican and work on campaigns. While campaigns always have a lot of passions that are incited, I'd say it's no more in that than any other profession or anything else, like watching a sporting event or something like that. But I spent a lot of time doing that, and then eventually went to law school and became a lawyer. Similar idea, a lot of logic involved in following the law, and then eventually became a lobbyist, where now instead of just looking at laws and interpreting laws, I get a hand in helping to craft legislation before it becomes law. And so it's a very interesting career path, but definitely shaped by my experiences in Jainism throughout my life.
All right, thanks, Parag. Parag, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Parag Mehta. I currently serve as the executive director of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. We are the philanthropic arm of MasterCard, which is a payments technology company. Prior to joining MasterCard 2 years ago, I spent about 17 years working in political campaigns and in government. Most recently, I was chief of staff to the United States Surgeon General in the Obama administration. And before that, I worked for a civil rights agency at the U.S. Department of Labor, where we worked to protect workers from discrimination in the workplace, but we also enforced rules around affirmative action that were designed to create more diversity in America's workplaces. I had previously worked at the Democratic National Committee, so I was there during a really exciting time period where the Democratic Party won back pretty much every major House and Senate in the country, as well as the US Congress and ultimately the White House. So we call it the 4 winningest years in the modern history of the Democratic Party. And I was part of what was called the 50-state strategy, which was an effort to reach out to constituents in all 50 states and train them on how to become good organizers. And it proved effective. I got my start in politics when I was in college. I was a student organizer at the University of Texas at Austin. And I think Jainism influenced my thinking about politics in a couple of ways. First is because I think Jainism is about compassion. And it teaches us that all life and all forms of life have divinity. And so if we can see every form of life from the amoeba to the human as having an element of divinity in it, then we have a moral responsibility to protect those lives and to enrich them. And as Chirag talked about, we are pro-life, but we're also pro-quality of life as Jains. And so we want to make sure that, for example, parents are not separated from their children because they're trying to seek asylum at a border, or that we're thoughtful about policies around the climate because we recognize that we have a responsibility to future generations. And so I grew up in Central Texas, and where I grew up, there was a saying that you never talk religion or politics at the table because it's considered rude. But actually, I think that politics and religion tell us a lot about our values and what we believe. And so I think it's really important to have a conversation about both. And for most of us who are Jains, we are immigrants to this country. I also think that as immigrants, we have a both moral responsibility, but also a responsibility to future generations of our families to give back to this country that has given us so much. And so that's why I like participating in the political process.
Great, thanks, Parag. Mishi, can you round us out?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Mishi Jain. Like Parag, I'm from the great state of Texas. I'm specifically from Houston, where I went to undergrad at Rice University. Currently, I'm in the Bay Area. I'm a student at Stanford Law School, so I'll be offering sort of a student perspective on getting to law school and why I chose to get to this path. Generally, I'm interested in the intersection of law, policy, and politics. I think I was very interested in this path sort of from a Jain perspective because I didn't see many people that look like me running for office or holding elected office. And so I was very interested in becoming a lawyer and also using the platform of policy making and politics to further policies that I feel strongly about. I think throughout high school, I got more interested in debate, which really interested me in the law career in general. But as I got into college, I got more involved with Democratic presidential campaigns. And then after that, worked with the White House Initiative on Asian Americans during a summer internship in D.C., which was a phenomenal experience. Thereafter, I was able to work with a federal judge, and that was a great insight into federal litigation generally, and that's something I hope to do in the future. And then this past summer, I worked at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, sort of working on my interest areas of the intersection of immigration policies and issues that affect the Asian American community. So very passionate about law and policy and hope to have a very public interest focused career in the future.
Thank you. So yeah, just I am very excited to have everyone here. And I think we have a good range of both backgrounds and sort of career paths. So hopefully that will be helpful for everyone to get a variety of different perspectives on what lawyers do. I practice in private practice with a law firm, and so I'll be adding a little bit of that experience for those of you who are interested in more of the firm aspect of things. So starting off with our first question. So what is it like to be a minority, both culturally and from a religious perspective as a Jain in the profession? And sort of going off of that, what did you guys, how did you find mentors to help you along your career? And can you talk about that? Maybe share a story or two. Parag, why don't we start with you?
Sure. When I was starting out in politics, there weren't a lot of Desi role models. I didn't know a lot of other Indian Americans or certainly Jains who were in the political field. But when I arrived in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2000, I also worked at the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And at the time, it had just been created by President Clinton, and it was designed to be a federal-wide initiative to help Asian Americans access government services and programs, which they had historically been left out of. There had been this theory for a long time in government that Asian Americans were a model minority, that we were successful, we were well educated, we were fine, and that we didn't really need government services. And so that became an excuse to ignore our needs. And in the mid-90s, a group of community advocates, including the folks at the Asian American Justice Center, where Mishi's working now, actually approached the Clinton administration and members of Congress with data to prove that, in fact, there were a lot of unmet needs in the AAPI community. And if you disaggregated the data about our communities, you would find some pretty startling statistics. And so I started my career in politics working for this initiative that was very much focused on bringing visibility to an invisible minority. And so your question about what is it like to be a minority in politics, I was fortunate that I got to work for an initiative that was tackling that issue head on. And one of the organizations that we worked with very closely at that time is where Chirag works today, and that's AHOA, because we recognize that the plight of small business owners in the South Asian community as hotel and motel owners, in the Korean community as grocers, were being overlooked by agencies like the Small Business Administration. When they were doing trainings for minority and women-owned businesses, they weren't doing outreach to us. They weren't providing materials translated into our languages. And so really creating this new model of partnership of what government could be doing with the private sector, with nonprofits, with advocates, was something that we started at that administration. It continued under President Bush and then under President Obama. And in some version, I think it's still continuing to this day. But always with each administration, there's going to be a changing focus. And so while Democratic administrations might focus more on things like discrimination and jobs and employment and healthcare, Republican administrations might focus more on things like business advancement and educational opportunities. So we may come at it from different perspectives, but the idea is to bring visibility to the populations and communities that have previously been invisible.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely something to talk about. I know Mishi interned at the White House Initiative for Asian American Pacific Islanders. I also had the opportunity to intern there, and that's definitely true. It changes with each administration. I think that's true within sort of the government and political arena. Interests of each administration change, and so it sort of contributes to the variety of things and the just a really nice. It doesn't really matter your political persuasion, but just to get a sense of what the different perspectives are and the different things that support the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and how people sort of evaluate those priorities. Chirag, do you want to take that question? You need to unmute yourself.
All right. How's that? Is that better? Great. So I never really looked at it in those terms, partly because I grew up in Wisconsin and the 6 other Indians were not very close, except for my brother, of course, who I know is watching and cheering us all on. So it's a very exciting time. But there weren't a ton of Indians. There was our family, and there were, of course, the Jain community, and it took us a little while to find everybody. I think our first YJA event, we all piled, all 6 of us piled to the Greyhound station to take a 14-hour Greyhound ride to Detroit for a YJA event for us to realize that there were not only other Indians, but other Jains in the country, and we got involved that way with YJA and with other things, and went on to participate for many years. But in my career, I never really looked specifically for Indians, and it's almost ironic because in the way that my career is sort of played out, I've actually ended up working with a lot of Indians. But I've never looked at it that way because the things that interested me was more of a community perspective overall. And to Parag's point about wanting to help out and to find opportunities to the community around you, that was not something that I necessarily sought out. But I did find mentors and people to look up to throughout the fledgling part of my career, whether it was legal or whether it was in the political side. When I was working with YJA, actually, when I was on the YJA board, one of my very good friends and colleagues on the board, Nisha Jain, was running the WLP program, Washington Leadership Program, an internship program for South Asians. And she recommended this would be something I should apply for when I was in college, and ended up in Washington, D.C. and paired with Congressman Joe Wilson from South Carolina, a conservative who happened to be the chair of the India caucus. And to this day, he still has a large Indian flag sitting right next to his desk. And he always talked about how entrepreneurial and hardworking Indians were. And I thought that was great, but I got to learn a lot from him and through the WLP program. And then from there went on to meet some other great folks. Kapil Sharma, who's in Washington, D.C., was a mentor of mine, has been for many years, really kept me on the straight and narrow. And there were, of course, political leaders. Congressman Wilson's chief of staff was an Indian guy, Dino Tapara, who's been a mentor of mine for many years. and he was from South Carolina, and at the time the majority whip in the House and went on to be governor was Nikki Haley, and of course she was Indian. So a lot of folks crossing paths in that way. But for me, perhaps as a Republican, perhaps as somebody who didn't eat meat or drink, I think I might have been the only campaign operative or perhaps person in the state of Wisconsin ever to not drink or eat meat, especially as a Republican. And so I kind of stuck out. And so they kept giving me more responsibilities and said, hey, if this guy can drive the congressman or drive the attorney general, he can probably tell us a thing or two on public policy. And so I kind of stuck out a little bit with the work that I did, and kept moving up in the ranks, and eventually went out to work at the RNC in a legal capacity there. So Jainism and being Indian sort of have come across, and I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention my current post as the head of government affairs for the Asian American Hotel Owners Association. Our members are all Desis. They're all by and large Gujaratis, but it's 18,500 members. They own 1 out of every 2 hotels in the country, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Less than 1% of the population owns half of an entire industry. And that's everything from your big box hotels all the way down to your independents, but mostly are franchise properties. And so on a daily basis, I represent our community with members of Congress and ensure that our interests are not only heard, but met, and that they are listening to our community throughout their legislative process. So that's sort of been my experience with our community in my career.
Chirag, if you ever find yourself going hungry at a Republican event, come over to one of ours. We always have vegan options.
I appreciate that.
All right, Mishi.
Yeah, I'll just add that I had a little bit of a different experience so far. I think throughout sort of high school and college and now in law school, I've always sort of tried to seek out Indian mentors, South Asian mentors generally. I think I was very shocked to just find out that there aren't that many Indian lawyers in general. It obviously is increasing, but that was a very important aspect to me. Like I wanted to have mentors who look like me, who are doing things that I could see myself doing in the future. So that was very important to me. So growing up, I don't have any lawyers in my family. I knew, I think, 1 or 2 lawyers generally in the Houston Sung. But I'm going to make another plug for WLP, as Chirag mentioned. It's a Washington Leadership Program, and it was the primary and first source that I had to finding nearly all of the South Asian mentors I have. So just a little bit about that. Each year, WLP selects South Asian students to intern in Washington, D.C. and like federal agencies or congressional offices. And that's how I was able to intern at the White House Initiative for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and had a phenomenal opportunity. But I was also able to meet people like Chirag, like Parag during that summer. And it was a phenomenal opportunity just to meet South Asians in D.C. who are doing all sorts of work in government and law and politics. And through WLP, I was able to find so many of my mentors who have assisted me in making so many decisions to this date. I would also add that like being a part of YJ has been instrumental. Many of the people in YJ, like Sapna, like other people who are doing law, have also assisted me in many decisions. So I would just echo that seeking out opportunities like WLP, like being involved with YJ and utilizing the programs you have at your disposal to find mentors is really important. And for me, finding mentors that look like me, come from similar backgrounds as me, and are doing exactly the kind of work I hope to do in the future has been really great. So I would just echo again that these programs are really great. There are many different programs that are targeted for Asian American students as well. So I would strongly encourage anyone who's interested in this field to sort of seek out those opportunities to build formal mentorships, but also just reach out to anyone that you find in the YJ community as well.
Yeah, so piggybacking off of that, just to talk about sort of private practice, law firm life, I think there's definitely a growing number of South Asians and Indians, in particular in the legal community, and definitely in firm life. I think we've seen that number increase. I know Mansi Shah, who's one of our panelists. She's not here right now, but she was the president of the she's a past president of the South Asian Bar Association for North America. So that is definitely an organization for both practitioners, people who are actually, in the courtroom doing work, but then also people who are doing legislative work and lobbying, sort of like Parag and Chirag have done. So that's definitely something to think about, and definitely what Mishi said, the Washington Leadership Program, WLP, that program, I think, spending the summer in DC, you walk around, and at least when I was there, you got to know a lot of Indian or South Asian people when you were there. DC, I think, at times can seem very big, but also it can seem very small, and so people are always willing to help and sort of take that extra step, which is great. In terms of like mentorship, I think there's something to be learned from mentors who are obviously Jain, but then also not Jain. Somebody is always willing to give you some nugget of information if you're willing to listen. And that doesn't mean that you have to take it, you don't have to take it to heart. If it doesn't work for you, that's fine. But this sort of goes to, the Jain value of anik-antvad, where, thinking about taking into account other people's perspectives and looking at a situation from a variety of different aspects. So that's sort of my plug on that side. And it's always helpful as a practicing lawyer to use anik-antvad to think about, what is opposing counsel going to do in this situation? And it's helpful when you have to think about what arguments you're going to have. So there's that plug. So for Chirag, can you talk a little bit about when you're lobbying or representing a client? Do you take into account your Jain values? So if there's something that comes up when, if you're lobbying for something and it may not necessarily align with how you grew up or what you're thinking about and how you see things, how do you reconcile that?
No, that's a great question, and I think that's true. Whether it's in the law, to your earlier point, I look at lobbying as an extension of legal practice, because you're talking about crafting legislation before it becomes law, and then of course law would be practicing once it's written. So you're talking about a lot of the similar concepts where you have to find your side. And what's interesting, and this probably is true of the campaign world as well, oftentimes you're looking at from one lens of a zero-sum game where you either win or you lose, and you're almost in a circumstance where if you lose, that's a huge problem. And so there are a lot of folks within all of those professions, whether it's campaigning or law or lobbying, where they want to win at all costs, and that is a huge problem. Because so much is riding on things, and I think that's true in our public policy discourse right now. It's so visceral, it's so passionate, because people feel as though if they do not win, the world is at stake, and as a result, folks are breaking off relationships, or they are vilifying the other side. And in our profession, we can't really do that, because if you despise somebody today, well, guess what? Tomorrow you're going to have to work with them anyway. But that also doesn't do anything great for you as far as your own personal passions go. Now, I would, of course, be dishonest if I said that I didn't have particular passions on the things that I represent or wanting to win, but that's also true of watching the Packers on Sunday. And so it is something that you need to figure out how well you can harness it, so you can channel that energy for a positive way to find a collaborative solution. In lobbying, ultimately, there are very few circumstances where you're going to pass legislation with only one party or one side. There are some big legislation we've seen over the last couple of years, the Affordable Care Act for one, and then the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act for two, over the last couple of years, that have been passed with one side only. However, the vast majority of enduring legislation that is helpful to the country is done in a bipartisan way. And so you do that by finding collaborative solutions and not alienating people and destroying their lives, which ultimately will destroy yours. And so in terms of whether it's an issue that I found, I haven't really found too many issues where they've somehow conflicted with my Jain beliefs, partly because of the folks that I've represented have not necessarily been, in terms of finding clients or finding a group that I've wanted to represent, that I haven't really found that to be a problem. But the way I would go about representing them, I think that conflict exists every single day, regardless of the profession.
All right. So Mishi, in terms of in a law school context, can you talk a little bit about, future considerations and decisions that you've made in terms of classes and clinics, or just more experiential learning type things, or did you choose extracurriculars that intersect with Jainism? Talk a little bit about that process for us.
Yeah, sure. So I think Jainism has definitely played a big role in sort of experiential learnings that I'm seeking out. One thing that I've tried to be really involved with during my time here is the Animal Law Pro Bono project. It's sort of the way I stay connected to my passion for animal rights, which directly relates to my Jain beliefs. But as part of our Animal Legal Defense Fund, we assist the larger national organization in conducting research for them on ongoing litigation, just providing research support for them. We bring speakers on campus that talk about different, that are like animal rights lawyers and things like that. So that's been a really interesting way that I've tried to stay connected to Jainism and sort of using the new legal tools that I'm learning on a daily basis for something that I'm really passionate about. Besides that, though, I've been trying to take a lot of classes and hoping to get involved with clinics that have to do with my public interest in government careers long term. So last quarter, I was involved in a public interest seminar where we talked about really interesting topics about the practice of public interest law, the different fields in that general field. And currently, I'm in a current issues in civil rights and civil liberties class taught by the former ACLU legal director. And that's been a really interesting class where we pick a different topic. So last week, we talked about affirmative action, which is definitely a heated topic that affects the Asian American community. We talked about Charlottesville the week before. So I've been trying to take classes that open my mindset and are introducing me to different civil rights areas. And I think in the future, I'm seeking out experiential learning opportunities that expand my interest in immigration and Supreme Court litigation generally. So I'm hoping to be involved with our Immigrants' Rights Clinic, which is led by an amazing South Asian woman who I believe was also a former chair of the South Asian Bar Association as well. And through that, through their pro bono project aspect, I've been helping young immigrants who are applying for asylum. So that's been a really rewarding experience for me. And I also hope to be part of the Supreme Court litigation clinic in the future as well. So overall, I'm just trying to seek out experiential learning opportunities that allow me to gain more experience in what policy and law and the intersection that looks like, but also maintaining my connection to Jainism by being a part of the Animal Law Pro Bono project.
Very cool. Do you guys get to like go hang out with animals? Do you get to play with puppies?
Unfortunately not.
All right. So Parag, the question that I had asked Parag before, but can you talk a little bit about, when lobbying or representing a client, how do you take into account Jain values? And then, if you face dilemmas in situations like that, give us a story, give us an example of what that's like and how you dealt with it.
Sure. Yeah, just to clarify, I've never lobbied before. I've always worked either on the campaign side or within a government office. But I would say that a couple of things. One is I tend to work for people who are aligned with my values. So I don't often run into a situation where I'm working in a place where those values get tested a lot. But that said, there are circumstances where I may disagree with a position or a point of view, and it may relate to my Jain values, but it could just be my own moral principles and the things I believe. And then I think the beauty of a career in politics when you've been in it long enough is you get to a level of sort of seniority and confidence in your own abilities that in those situations, you don't feel like you have to choose. You feel like you have the agency and are empowered to speak up and say, actually, I don't agree with this, and this is why I don't agree with it. And I understand that it's not common across all of politics. There's certainly places where people don't feel that empowerment and that agency to speak up. But one example I'll give you is that during the Obama administration, like I said, I worked on civil rights issues in the Labor Department, and then I worked on public health issues in the Department of Health and Human Services. And there were issues around the administration's war on terrorism and the use of drone strikes in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan that had nothing to do with my job. It had nothing to do with what I was working on. It was completely separate from my work. And yet I disagreed with it. And I got to a point where I had to ask myself that as a Jain person who believes very strongly in ahimsa, how do I feel about working for a president who is knowingly ordering the killings of innocent civilians as collateral damage in trying to fight terrorism. And I felt at some point that because I had worked on his campaign and because I had played a role in helping to get elected and I was playing a role in the success of his administration, that it was perfectly fine for me to speak up and say I disagreed. And in some administrations, that could have been cause for me to get fired. I could have lost my job over it. But I'm really proud of the fact that in the Obama administration, I actually, when I started posting on social media my feelings about this, other Obama appointees joined me and they said, we disagree too. And so we were able to air our concerns. And to me, this is one of the reasons why I picked the Democratic Party, because I think part of being in the Democratic Party means that we believe in the big tent, and we believe in welcoming people with different sets of belief. We have pro-life Democrats and pro-choice Democrats, and we have pro-war and anti-war Democrats. And so being able to express that is really, I think, one of the key factors of being politics. Don't come into politics if you just want to be a yes man, because then you're not going to advance the agenda for anybody. If you have a point of view and you're willing to stand up for that point of view in a manner that is respectful and that respects civil discourse and respects people's differences of opinion, then come in, because we need those voices. And the last thing I'll say is this. One of the things I love most about Jainism is that we're not an evangelical religion, meaning we're not trying to convert others. There is no proselytizing in Jainism. As my grandfather used to say to us, we're all responsible for our own moksha. And so even in a marriage, if I disagree with what my husband's point of view is, it's not my job to change him, because his karma is his and my karma is mine. And so I think that we have to keep that in mind, because a lot of people ask me, how can you be a Jain and work in politics when Jainism clearly talks about sort of non-partisanship or non-alignment? And I say it's because I work in politics to advance a set of views and values that I carry. But of course, it's my job to try and persuade others to believe what I believe and to come over to my side of thinking. But it is not my expectation that the only way for the world to work is if people do things the way I see them. That is not my path in life. That's not my path to salvation. It's not my idea of truth. And so we each pursue truth however we see it. And to me, if you come into politics with that mindset, I think you're going to be more successful. I think you're going to be more valuable to the system. And I think that you're going to be happier.
All right. So sort of going off that, this is a question that I think is good for just to get a sense, because we have such a wide range of people that may be watching. How did you guys, and this sort of ties into our earlier question, but how did you sort of come to decide what you believe in? And that's something that people can decide very early on. That's something that is constantly changing for some people. And you know, talk about what that process was like. Did Jainism, if there's a particular belief you want to talk about, or policy issue that you want to talk about, you know, feel free to run with that. But how has that process been for you guys? Mishi, you want to kick us off? Kick it off.
Sure. Yeah, I would just say that I think prior to college, I hadn't really formed any of my beliefs super clearly. I mean, you know, I was sort of doing my own thing, didn't have super clear beliefs on like exactly what I wanted to believe in or what side I fell on. I think after entering college, I sort of started realizing, and I think Jainism definitely played a big role in this, as to what sort of my foundational ethical and moral beliefs are, which a lot of them come from Jainism, and sort of how that translates to which party I support or which policies I support, which I think that's where it falls more strongly. So I kind of would say that I think growing up, going to Bachelor and just learning about so many of the core Jain principles, something that was very instilled in me from a young age was this idea of exerting as much compassion as you can, empathy for different kinds of beings, for all souls. We're taught in Bachelor, but to be concerned about the soul of a bacteria and try to avoid himsa as much as we can. And so having that fundamental belief in nonviolence so ingrained in me, I think really shaped the reason as to why I identify as a progressive, and I strongly believe in many progressive beliefs. I generally think, for example, with immigration, I want to not separate families at the border. I want to support people who are trying to come here and live better lives. I think the progressive policies I support are trying to uplift as many individuals as many souls as possible. and as being as inclusive as possible in order to have a better discourse and more just a better inclusive society. So I think a lot of this sort of formulated for me in college while I was involved in different organizations. Specifically, I got involved with our on-campus think tank, the Baker Institute for Public Policy. And that was a really great opportunity for me to be exposed to researchers and scholars of all different policy backgrounds. But overall, I think sort of Jainism's fundamental belief in nonviolence, for me personally, really paved the way for me to become more progressive and find policies that fall more in line with that.
All right, Chirag.
Yeah, that's great. Well, yeah, I think this runs a gamut both on the legal side as well as the political side. You know, I found my political calling on the right and the conservative movement for a lot of the reasons we talked about early on. You know, Jainism has always been a faith based in logic, and that's something that I spent a lot of time really appreciating. But you know, it's interesting. I pick up on something that Parag mentioned. His grandfather said that we're all responsible for our own moksha, and I found that tenet of individual responsibility to be particularly enlightening. Actually, it's been something that is a cornerstone of the Jain faith. I mean, you know, Jainism teaches us that we must take control of our own actions, our own thoughts, our own words. And we are responsible for all of those things. I mean, there's no concept in Jainism in which you know, someone who is perhaps less than an altruistic, somebody who has a lot of pop, who lies and steals, what have you, can look to somebody with a lot of punya, and there's no overarching organization that will say, okay, well, your punya is over here. We're going to give this guy with a lot of pop some of your punya. It's not how that works, right? So that's the concept of individual responsibility that's been particularly interesting to me. And you know, compassion to me has really been rooted in the free enterprise system. Free enterprise has been the hallmark and has really been the source of uplifting billions of people out of poverty across the world. It is the single most important avenue for uplifting people out of poverty. I mean, we look just to India. We don't need to look any further than that. I mean, when just before my father came to the U.S., India was under a state of martial law. They were looking to nationalize all private industry, take private land from individuals, and India was in a state of disarray. And that's why you had such an immigration to the United States, because people were looking for freedom of opportunity, and those freedoms were what has been the hallmark for our culture and our community to really be uplifted in the United States. And so that has been something that I found to be particularly interesting. And in the work that I do now, you know, simple things that I think of when I think of course, nonviolence, but helping others. You know, one of the areas that I work on considerably, and that I've spent the majority of my time as an organization, AHOA has become one of the leaders in human trafficking prevention. You wouldn't necessarily think about that for a lodging association to do, but human trafficking occurs because criminals want to exploit their victims under the guise of anonymity, and they do so in hotels because they know they can get anonymity there. So for many years, AHOA has been a leader in that, and I've taken that on as a calling because of the importance of nonviolence, and whether that's working with victims' rights organizations or task forces at a state level, helping to appreciate how and provide insight into state laws and even federal laws that are being drafted, but helping to save lives first and foremost. And for people that, based on their circumstances, have fallen victim to modern day slavery, this issue kind of found me, but I took particular interest in it because of our Jain beliefs of helping others. So that's sort of the tie-in both on the political side as well as on the lobbying side now.
Awesome. Parag?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, as far as why I got into politics and how I sort of figured out what I believe in, there were a number of incidents throughout my childhood that sort of got me on this path. But the one that really strikes me as transformative was when I was in the 6th grade. We studied in social studies class, we learned about the Holocaust. And I remember we did a whole a learning course on it, and then we watched a film about it, and it was traumatic. Like, I remember getting very, very sick, and I actually stayed home from school for a couple of days because I felt really sickened by the idea that people did this not to strangers. They did this to people who were their neighbors, who had lived in their communities. And I remember having a conversation with my dad where I said, how could this happen? How could neighbors turn on neighbors and let this horrible thing happen to them? And he said to me, he said, Parag, it's important for you to remember that in good times, people can get along. But when things go wrong, you can never predict how human beings will react. And that's why it's really important for us as immigrants in this country. We're brown, we look different, we look like foreigners, that we should never get too complacent, that we should always remember that we stand out and that we should be on guard about it. And he told me that we still had a home in Gujarat, my grandparents' home, we still owned it. And he said, if ever you sense that the tide in this country is turning, don't wait. Don't be the frog in the pot of boiling water who waits too long to realize it's time to jump out. Leave, because this is ultimately not your home. This is not the place where you will be accepted. Go back to India and remember that you will always have a community there. And the thing I took away from that conversation is that my dad's a really smart man and he's right 99% of the time. But this was the 1% where he was wrong. Because while America may have been a destination for him and for his generation, this was my home. I was born here. I'm an American citizen. The person I married became a citizen because of me. And I was not comfortable with the idea that there could ever be a time where somebody else would tell me I no longer belonged here. And the only way to prevent that from happening, and the Holocaust being the most extreme example, but we're seeing a lot of xenophobia and discrimination and racism right now in our country, and it's being fomented by people in the highest levels of power. And we each have a responsibility, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, a Jain, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, we each have a responsibility to stop that and to remind people that what it means to be an American is we may speak different languages and we may worship different gods, but we've agreed to a social contract, a set of laws and rules and principles that we all agree to protect. And that's why I got into politics, because I believe that somebody has to watch the lawmakers. Somebody has to watch the people making and enforcing the rules. And I wanted to be one of those people. The only other thing I want to add is, Chirag and I are friends, and we obviously are on different sides of the political aisle. It's really interesting always to talk with Chirag because I learn a lot about his perspectives. When you talk about individual responsibility, I think you're absolutely right in the way that my grandfather conceived it, which is that we're responsible and accountable for our actions on this earth and the price that we pay for in our karma. But that should also not negate the second side of the coin, the flip side of that coin, which is the fact that we don't live lives alone. We are born alone, we die alone, but we live our lives in a community and in a society. And you've heard Mishi use the word Sangh a couple of times. We talk about our Jain Samaj. This idea that we are part of a community, and when you're a part of a community, you can't just think about the individual interest and what's right for me as an individual, but will advance my cause as an individual. We also have an obligation to the society in which we live. And so when we do Paryushan and when we perform the act of Attai, where we fast for 8 days, it's worth noting that the punya goes to the faster, but it also goes to the person who serves them the food to break the fast. That is the idea of service, the idea that we have an obligation to do good karma through our deeds. And so to me, the idea of individual responsibility, while a very American idea, it is not to be taken out of context in Jainism, because we as individuals have a responsibility to the people sitting next to us too.
Well, if I can, I think that's true to an extent. I mean, the ultimate objective of Jainism is not to accumulate the most punya either. The ultimate objective of Jainism is to have no karma, right? Is to break the cycle of karmic bondage, of life and death and rebirth. And ultimately, it is the predicate of individual responsibility, not necessarily to be the one that has altruism based on what others believe altruism should be, but rather one's individual responsibility. So while I agree with you that there's definitely a place and an obligation that we have while we live our lives to ensure that we're helping others, and that's frankly a cultural construct, that's a social construct, certainly is a religious construct. I wouldn't necessarily say that that is the ultimate objective, because Jainism teaches us otherwise, I believe.
I would just say that we start from a deficit, right? When we're born in human form because we're starting from a deficit. So the reason why we try to acquire punya, you're right, the net goal is to get to zero, because in order to achieve moksha, you want to get to zero. But the whole concept is that we're born into human form or animal form because we're starting from a deficit. So we want to live our lives accumulating punya. And one way to accumulate punya is to do good in the world. Now, you're right, that can be subjective in terms of how we define it, but feeding the hungry, clothing the needy, those seem to be fairly objective standards across all religions of what is good.
Yeah.
Misha, you were saying something?
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore something Parag said a little bit earlier. I think regardless of where you fall on the political line, Parag mentioned the fact that, we are minorities, but this is our home. And so something I wanted to really underscore was encouraging many of the viewers and Jains in general to become more active, regardless of if you're going into the legal field or not. So something I would say is run for office, or if you don't want to run for office, support campaigns or call your representatives. I mean, regardless of what field you're going in, if it's legal or not, policy is going to affect your life in any industry. And so I just wanted to underscore what Parag was saying was about we need more representation of people who look like us. But if that's not something that you're interested in, call your representatives, voice your beliefs on things that you are for or against, and definitely stay engaged in the political process.
Yeah, and I think going off of that, the very basic premise, I think everyone on this panel will tell you, go vote, whether it's local elections, whether it's national elections, it doesn't matter. Your vote counts, and that's the only way that, our community's voice will be heard, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. So that's definitely something to think about. And for all of you guys who are turning 18 soon, make sure you go register to vote. So one of the questions that we've gotten is, was there any societal or parental pressure against going into law because it's not sort of a traditional vocation among Jains? And I actually think I'm sort of going to kick this question off. I think the legal career is now, it's sort of falling more into what is acceptable, quote unquote. You've got doctors, you've got engineers, finance, I think, is always a big area. Business is big. But I think more and more law is being accepted, and just seeing people who look like us across the spectrum politically is a huge thing. And it showcases the diversity of South Asians and helps sort of break the model minority myth that's out there, that we're not all, perfect A students that are doing whatever anybody wants us to do.
Isn't your brother an engineer?
That's beside the point. But I think it is, do what you want to do. And I think it's sort of changing in terms of what is more acceptable. But anybody else want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, when we were in India and we were telling my cousins what I do for a living, and there's just this look of abject horror over the elders' faces that was involved in politics. Apparently, that word conjures images of just like the lowest forms of one's vocation. In India, for sure, there's a thought of corruption, of just something that is totally beneath something that people of our station in life as Jains should do, which I find fascinating for a variety of reasons. But perhaps that's not the case in the United States. You're right. It's not been a traditional field of Indians. Granted, I went to law school at the University of Missouri, where I was one of 2.5 Indians. So, I perhaps like to find the places where, and there's apparently not a lot of us, but at the same time,
who was the half an Indian?
His mom
was it like a really short person, or was it just like
his mom was
mixed race?
I think his dad was.
Just want to clarify.
We take what we can get. We tried to form a student association, but you need 3, and we only had 2.5, so they wouldn't let it.
You didn't have quorum.
That's right. But yeah, so it's not the traditional field, but hopefully it will become the traditional field. It's so much more fun than being an engineer, so much more fun than being a doctor. My wife is a physician, and we graduated a week apart from each other from law school and med school respectively. And I like to tease her and tell her that actually I was the first doctor in the family, because what is the JD but a Juris Doctor? So she told me the next time they look for a doctor in an emergency situation, I should raise my hand. That's probably bad for the victim, but I think it's a much better profession than it gets a reputation for, especially amongst our people.
I definitely hope there's a real doctor there, Chirag, just in case anything
Hey,
actually.
if you're there will be one. So.
Yeah, if I have a heart attack on a plane and they call for a doctor on board and I see your face, Chirag, I'm not going to be happy.
Hey, well, if you need to sue somebody afterwards,
you're my guy. You're my guy. So I'll just say, look, let's get to the bottom of this trope, because every BSE conference I go to, this is the constant question, right? Why do our parents want us all to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, and IT specialists? And by the way, Sapna, you are fine being a lawyer as long as you're like in a big private law firm. It's completely acceptable for BSE parents. So there's two reasons I think that this exists. And this is, by the way, not unique to us. When you meet Nigerian community folks, or when you meet people from other Asian American communities, this is sort of across the board. It's an immigrant thing, right? And the reason why it's so common among immigrants to focus on these four professions is because two things. One is those are the professions they recognize, right? To Chirag's point, if you go to India and you explain that I'm a lobbyist for the Asian American Hotel Owners Association, that is not something that in India they can have a connection to, because they don't have the kind of democratic institutions that we do, where we do advocacy and where we do lobbying. So these are recognizable professions around the world: doctor, lawyer, engineer, IT. The second reason is because if you're an immigrant to this country, what is the thing that you crave the most? Sure, you want a better life. Sure, you want a good quality education for your kids. But the thing you're really looking for is stability, right? Because it's the thing that you gave up. You walked away from everything you had, whether you're an immigrant or a refugee. You walked away from everything you had to seek a new life in a new place that's different and foreign for you. And so what do you most crave for yourself and for your family? Stability. So BSE parents are not doing it out of some sort of evil plan to make our lives miserable and make us work in jobs we hate. They're doing it because they recognize these jobs and because they want us to have career stability. So what's the antidote? If you want to work in politics, if you have the passion that Chirag and Mishi and Sapna and I have to make a difference in the world, the way to sell it to a parent is by focusing on the stability aspect of these jobs. That, you know, economies go up and down, but there's an election in this country every 2 years. So I told my parents when I decided not to be a doctor and to go into politics, I'm going to be employed for life, because even if I'm not very good at this job, there are 435 members of Congress who have to get reelected. Surely one of them is going to hire me. Focus on the economics of the situation. BSE parents want stability for their kids. Law and politics can be a career of great stability if you are focused about it, if you figure out what you're good at doing there, and if you hone your skills and move to the top of your profession, you'll have no problem getting employed.
Mishi, you have anything to add on this one?
No, I think they covered it all. I mean, I would definitely agree. I think the lawyer career in general is definitely accepted as one of the typical careers now. I think it gets a little bit tougher when you get into the public interest, government, politics side of things. But my parents have been very supportive about it. I think definitely all my friends and family have been very supportive about it. So I think just like Chirag and Parag were mentioning, it's about sort of selling your case and making them understand that you're going to have job stability, but also that you have something bigger in mind, whether it's wanting to create systemic change, a policy that you want to work on, whatever it is. I think sort of selling that will do it for you.
I would caution folks who are looking into going into the law, you will start to get all kinds of random people out of the woodwork to ask you for legal advice that you are not qualified to give. I practiced in elections law, and I can't tell you the number of people that have called me to help get them out of tickets, or read their contracts for their new house, or negotiate a settlement, or sue somebody. So, you know, good luck with that. But other than that, it's a great job.
But going off of that, there's probably somebody that you could ask. So if I did have a question about election law, I could talk to Chirag.
Her name is Sapna Jain, and there's contact information which we'll put up at the end of this.
Definitely not. But that being said, I think as an attorney and sort of the law school approach is helpful in terms of a variety of different things at the end of the day. If you end up not actually practicing law, the analytical thinking, the logic, the sort of steps that you go through and that you learn will help you no matter what. If anything, it'll make you a better writer. You may cringe while you're in law school because that's all you do, but you know, being a practitioner now, and that's, I was telling these guys earlier, I'm writing a brief that I have to get, so that I have to get done. So it's that kind of stuff. Very practical skills and persuasion, all of that sort of stuff that is helpful both at home and at work. You know, trying to get people on your side and building consensus and compromise is something that is always necessary in life, no matter what. So what advice, and some people have touched on this, but what advice do you have for somebody pursuing a career in your field, whether it be, sort of if you are, and Parag, actually, I'm sort of looking at you going from the public service side to what you do now. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of your transition into a new role?
Sure. So what I do now is I look after philanthropy at MasterCard, which is a global payments technology firm. You might think of it as the card that's in your wallet, but actually we do a lot more than that. We help advise governments and society on how to build cashless economies. The thing that I focus on, though, is I don't work for the corporate side of MasterCard. I work for the philanthropic side. And my job is to combat poverty and inequality. So the same work that I was trying to do in government, but now in a private sector lens with a lot more resources and the ability to scale a lot faster. And the reason why I moved into this, well, one, because I lost my job in government. I'm kind of like living in exile right now, trying to get back home. But in the meantime, I've got a pretty good gig where I get to advance this idea of sustainable and equitable economies for everyone that work for everyone. There's been a lot of progress, both in terms of technology and in terms of economic progress in the last 50 years. But there are also a lot of people around the world who have not benefited from that progress. And so this whole idea of addressing income inequality is centered to what we do at the center. But there's a second side of it, which is also addressing the growing issue of information inequality. We are all right now, 38, 40 of us, on a Google Hangout, sharing information, sharing knowledge, sharing know-how. And that's terrific. But there are a lot of people in our world who, because they lack access to this kind of technology, because they lack access to these kinds of networks, they will never be able to get ahead. No matter how ambitious or talented they are, they will always be left behind. And so what we're trying to figure out at MasterCard is how can we put the resources of our company, which includes over $500 million in philanthropy, but also a global network of data and technologists and expertise to try and solve these issues. And I would say that as far as the advice I would give to people listening is whether you choose to pursue a career in politics or law or not, as I think Sapna said earlier, we can all participate in some way. If it's as simple as registering to vote and going out and voting in every election, every time, because they are all the most important elections of our lifetime, then that's your act of civic participation. But at a higher level, I think we should all make the effort to stay informed about issues, to seek truth, because Jainism calls on us to seek truth, and to speak truth as well. And then the last piece of advice I'd give you is this: no matter what career or profession you're in, I have always been well served in my life by following two principles when it comes to a job. Only work for causes that inspire you, and for causes that matter, and for people who inspire you. When you do that, even if you struggle with hard times, even if you feel frustrated at work, even if the workload becomes overwhelming, you will at the end of the day feel satisfied with what you are doing. So find those causes that matter and work for those people who inspire you, and you'll do pretty well in life.
And one thing I just want to say, Parag, that's awesome advice and definitely something to think about. It takes time to figure out what it is that inspires you. And so for a lot of people, your first job isn't going to be what you do forever. While that may have been what was normal in the legal profession, where you left law school and started a job at a law firm and then did that for the next 30, 40, 50 years of your life, that's definitely not the case anymore. And the legal field is constantly changing, and there are new opportunities that open up every day. So don't be afraid to sort of take that chance and try something different. Mishi.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah. What advice do you have for someone sort of pursuing a career? And as a law student, what's helpful advice for future law students?
Yeah, sure. So I think I would say sort of seek out opportunities and programs that allow you to explore a bunch of different opportunities. So like Sapna was mentioning, most people don't do the same job as soon as they graduate from law school forever. I mean, people are changing jobs every 2 or 3 years. So as much as you can before law school, but even after, seek out opportunities where you can begin to figure out things that you like and things that you don't like. So again, plug for Washington Leadership Program. That was a phenomenal way for me to figure out if law school was something I wanted to do. So during my time in DC, while I was interning, I took it upon myself to meet with different South Asian professionals and non-South Asian professionals in DC, people who had JDs, people who didn't, people who were doing things I wanted to do, people who weren't necessarily that I didn't see myself doing. And that summer was extremely transformative for me. There are many similar programs. There are mentorship programs through the South Asian Bar Association. There's APACs. There's so many different organizations directed for Asian American college students. So I'd highly encourage people who are sort of trying to figure out if law school is right for them, or if they've decided on that, what sort of professions within that field work for them, to seek out those opportunities and build mentorships. And I would also highly encourage people from just beyond voting as a very baseline thing. I would encourage people to join campaigns. I mean, 2020 election is coming upon us really soon, and there are incredible candidates in the field. And so whether it's on the presidential field or not, I mean, I really encourage people to get involved with campaigns as much as they can this upcoming election.
Thanks. And we just had another panelist join us, Raj Shah. Raj, can you just give us a sort of a quick background on what you do and how you got to where you are today?
Hi guys, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry again for being late. You know, I would say I stumbled into a career in communication specifically, and into some of the stuff I've been doing over the last few years. You know, I was very interested in politics. I applied for an internship in a scheduling office at the White House, and I picked scheduling because I had scheduled a bunch of events, and they put me in a part of the scheduling office where I did research all the time, and then sparked a career in opposition research, which is where I cut my teeth and did a lot of work over the course of almost a decade. And then in the 2016 presidential election cycle, I ran opposition research for the Republican Party. And then when we won, went to the White House. So, and that's the long and short of it. But ended up doing a lot of public facing and on camera and you know, pretty visible stuff. And that was through kind of dint of a little bit of luck. And I became the person who was briefing everyone. So they said, why don't we throw this guy on camera and stop being a middleman? You know, I kind of liked it, and I think I was kind of good at it. But, you know, I think that public policy debate and politics as a whole is so much fun, and I'm always going to try to keep a toehold in it.
Great. And sort of and adding to that, so did Jainism play a role in, you know, why you chose to pursue the career that you did? If not, that's totally okay, because
the answer is probably not a ton, and I would say that I probably wasn't you know, the best practicing Jain when I was younger, and I've kind of turned to it I'd say a little bit later in life. I would say also that ideologically I'm not a big believer in kind of having, you know, the government involved in what I think is a little bit more personal. But I do try to separate. I mean, you know, my role is that of a spokesperson, right? And you do try to separate sometimes personal views or personal conduct from what you think others should do, you know, in their roles, or, you know, what public policy should be. And so, you know, in that sense, I've tried to practice properly with my own life, you know, with some ups and downs. But I think that's where I try to hold myself accountable. I would say, just to be totally honest, because I kind of stumbled into this career over time, I just enjoyed it, you know, and I think that if you can find something you're passionate about to do for a living every day, that's as good as it gets.
Yeah, that's definitely what I think most of the panelists here have talked about, that and being passionate about your career, whether you know that right off the bat or it takes a little bit of time to figure that out. That's definitely a theme here. Chirag, do you want to talk about advice you have for somebody pursuing a career?
Yeah, I'd say especially starting with the law. If you watch television and you believe that law is that practice, you will be sorely mistaken, as I was in some ways. I enjoyed debate and things like that in high school because obviously, athletics is not the forte of our people, except for my brother, who was a state ranked tennis player. Chintan, I know you're one of the 40, so figured I'd give you that shout out. But no, if you're watching TV and you see the law in practice where there's a crime that happens on a Wednesday and they're at trial by Thursday and they're at appeal by Friday, that's just not what happens. You put in a lot of time to work in reading and writing and understanding process and procedure. Frankly, television, if it were to accurately portray the law, should just have a person sitting behind a computer and scrolling for 45 minutes trying to figure out whether a case is on point or not. That's what you're going to be practicing out of the gate. However, it is still an invaluable experience to go through understanding and learning the law. Every profession that I could think of, every field that you could potentially go in, your ability to succeed in that field will be enhanced exponentially by virtue of a law degree because of your understanding of whether it's logic studies or the ability to build and craft an argument, and whether it's speak or present in front of others. It is a tremendous skill. And so for me, the law has really been a conduit for my career in politics and public policy. And so that's how I got interested in it. But as far as advice, so there's my pitch and plug for wanting to follow this career. A couple of things I'd suggest would be to find a network. I think everybody on this panel has discussed the importance of whether it's the South Asian network or just a network in general. The way I went about it was going to first folks actually at Darasar that might have known a lawyer at the time, or things along those lines. I shadowed folks while I was in high school, and then eventually got involved. YJ has been quite possibly the greatest network that I had to start my career in education, but of course then my professional career in putting me in touch with so many great folks. But not just finding the network, but keeping in touch with that network. It is very easy to lose touch with folks once you've started something and something new, but to go back and give folks an understanding, hey, this is what I'm up to. And this is what I've continued to be involved in. That network, especially when it comes to the public policy sphere, it was funny. We were all joking that we all know one another or know other people that we all know pretty closely because it is a small world. It's a small world, certainly of Jains. There's 6 of us in Wisconsin. So, but there's apparently like 15 in the rest of the world. So, or at least the country. So, that's a small network, but there's so many others that can be helpful to you. So find a network, stay in touch with them, and then stay true to your philosophy. Parag, I think, said it very eloquently in talking about what you're passionate about. But in the big things and in the small things, certainly in public policy, it's you can find your moral right and go after it. But it's how you do it on a day-to-day basis and your interactions with others. Getting involved in a huge cause and finding a whole bunch of people that agree with you is great. But it's how do you communicate with those who disagree with you, and how do you maintain the relationships with those with whom you may disagree? That I think is where our Jainism at a very basic and intimate level, which I believe the faith really is about, is what is going to be important. And so those individual relationships, how you practice it, going and maintaining a relationship with your Darasar community, and even simple things. I wear a suit and tie every day, but I found a way to get rid of all my silk ties, things like that. You can find some pretty cheap microfiber ties online. So those would be the things that I'd recommend for folks. And hopefully we'll see you after you pass the bar.
The joys of studying for the bar. I think most of us will be on that, but
a lot of us after the bar exam. Yeah.
Is anybody else want to add anything to that?
I want to know where he gets his microfiber ties.
Amazon. They're like $4 and they're fantastic.
I used to invest in faux leather shoes. Payless shoe store used to have a whole line of dress shoes that were faux leather. They stopped doing that now. Somebody should work on bringing that back.
Belts too. A lot of vegan belts you can get online. Nike has their golf line is fantastic. So if anybody's in the market.
This is the after hours part of our hangout.
Actually, I think YGA may have I think at one point it was an initiative to put together a list of a variety of different things that are like non-leather, non-silk providers. But Raj, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Well, I would just say I think I need to find where to get those vegan belts. I don't have a ton of specific stuff where it applies to Jainism specifically, but I would say spirituality and morality there, and Chirag kind of just touched on it. There are different ways to practice it, and I think in my experience, I'm a brown guy kind of on the other side of the aisle, and I like kind of look at my Twitter feed and get kind of vilified for it all the time. And I think that's very surface level, and the folks who are doing that sometimes, whatever, I can take it, but they know very little about kind of me and my life and my lifestyle. And I think how you conduct yourself and how you practice your faith can be done with, are you helping other folks that are around you? Are you being honest with both the people that work for you and that you work for? And these very simple things and the ways in which you conduct yourself are paramount to being a good practicing Jain or being just a good person. And I think, matter so much more than sometimes the things that folks get associated with. And I think losing sight of that would be terrible for anybody going through anything in their career. And it's something kind of I've had to relate to and kind of deal with at a personal level. And I would just say that it's pretty meaningful, and that your personal kind of morality and actions, that's what you will be judged by, and what you what will take you kind of past whatever you're doing in your specific job or your career, and that to me is the most important and most fundamental to being a good Jain, regardless of your specific vocation or what your job is or anything else, and that's something I've tried to keep with myself.
All right, that's definitely helpful, and just hear that's so practical in this environment that we're in every day. So just remembering what we learned in kindergarten, that kind of stuff. We had a question about those who pick jury members. So we have somebody here who is on a jury. So Chirag, can you talk a little bit about what that, sort of in maybe a few minutes, less than that, tell us about what that was like.
So I participated in the voir dire process as an attorney, not as first chair, but at least in the preparations for it. When I practiced a little bit, but the personal experience I have intimately on this was last year. I served on a jury in just outside of Washington D.C. The case at the time, we didn't know it, but we were brought into the courtroom, and the attorneys asked a bunch of rather superficial questions, and turned out that the person, and so I was selected for the jury, one of 12, and the defendant was a drug dealer who was doing some pretty rough stuff. He was selling fentanyl, which I didn't know was a thing, but apparently is like a really aggressive version of heroin. And I mean, the counts against him were pretty aggressive, and he was a terrible witness. And his defense, his defense attorney was awful, but I mean, public defenders generally are overworked and underpaid and understaffed. I mean, they have just yeoman's work to do. And so he was just in a rough spot, but he was also a perpetrator of narcotic sales to young people in our community. So there's no good of that. There's just a moral dilemma that you have, and you're sitting on a jury. This person's fate is technically in your hands, and you can't, you feel the compassion because you want to let him try to rehabilitate himself, but at the same time, you have a responsibility to community to to make sure that the justice is done for the community. And this guy was doing some pretty rough stuff. And so we ended up finding him guilty, didn't find him for the maximum, but he was put in jail for many years. And it's something I think about a lot. So.
Yeah, I think something we've heard about a lot, whether on both sides of the aisle, is criminal justice reform and what that looks like. And a lot of people have different opinions about it, but I think it's something that has been in public discourse for a while and is definitely coming back up. So we are sort of getting close to time, but I just wanted to ask our panelists. Well, first off, thank you for being a panelist. But sort of takeaways. What are some final thoughts that you guys have for the people who are watching this? Mishi?
Sure. So I think all of us have echoed this throughout the webinar, but the first thing to take away is that policy and politics affects us all. And so encourage and call everyone to action to do more than just voting. I mean, definitely do that. But realize that policy affects every different field, regardless of if you're going to be a lawyer or not. So get involved in any way you can. Get involved with campaigns. Call your representatives when you support or oppose a policy. Doing any of that is going to be helpful. The second thing I would say, something that Chirag mentioned earlier, is one, develop your mentors. Reach out to any of us after this panel, people in the YJ community, but more than that, be sure to stay in touch. I think during a few of my summers in DC, I actually began to realize how true it is that everyone really knows each other in the field. And so if you're entering this field, it really is important to maintain those connections, stay in touch with your mentors. Yeah, that's what I would say.
All right, Parag? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Find a career that inspires you and gives you passion. Seek truth throughout your life, because Jainism calls on us to do that. And remember the words of Dr. King, which is, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. And public service is one of the most noble ways to serve your country and your community. So whether you vote or you stay informed on issues or you run for office yourself, always find ways to serve the communities in which you live.
Chirag?
I think it's been well said. Jai Janendra and Michami Dukram.
Raj?
Yeah, I just echo others about choosing a line of work, whether in public policy or not, that you're very passionate about, because life will be a lot more fun that way. And otherwise, as Chirag said, Jai Janendra and Michami Dukram.
So yeah, I'm laughing because somebody asked, "Are we doing Aarti and Mangal Deva after this?" So that's for you guys to do at home. But I would be remiss to say today is Mahavir Jayanti, so Mahavir Janma Kalyanak, the birth celebration of the 24th Tirthankar, Mahavir Bhagwan. And I think most of you guys have Mahavir Jayanti programs either this weekend or the weekend after at your local Jain center. So definitely try to attend those. Talk to your YJ local reps who are there, your YJ board members who will probably be there, and get involved in YJA. Otherwise, I would just like to thank our panelists, and for those who are watching, if you have any other questions, feel free to email education@yja.org. And thank you very much for watching.
Thanks, Sapna. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.